Welcome to another episode of Ask the Expert on Contingent Workforce Strategies LinkedIn group, the #1 group on LinkedIn for the contingent workforce and talent acquisition industry. I've got an amazing episode today. It's going to be fabulous.
Wait. I thought I was going to be doing this today. So let's change the subject. I want to talk about independent contracting and what independently is doing because it's really curious to me. So Jeff, I'm going to be the moderator today.
All right, you take over, sir. I'll be the guest.
All right, great. So what is independent contractor compliance and why is it so important today?
So independent contractors compliance is just making sure that you are employing and engaging with independent contractors in a compliant manner when you look at employment laws, tax laws, and regulations. Why is it so important today is we're getting back into a world that has been evolving. And due to the pandemic, the trend towards remote work, there's also a huge trend towards freelancing and independent contractors brought on by the gig economy and the platforms, making remote work and gig type work just so accessible to people as an alternative to the traditional employment career that you had for many, many years. And you got the gold watch and you retired and you had a pension, right?
Yep.
More and more people are choosing to be independent contractors. If you think about the gig economy, you think about the creator economy. You see all the people, and we see them all, we scroll every day and we see these people that are on it. They're making hundreds of thousands of dollars through the gig economy and the creator economy as self-employed independent contractors. And so people are choosing that for lifestyle reasons, almost more importantly these days for tax purposes and financial incentive reasons. So in a lot of jurisdictions, be it certain states, but also provinces and countries, due to the pandemic and just financial, management issues, there's difficulties going on right now. And so you're seeing personal tax rates continue to climb little by little to pay for government expenditures. And with that, people are saying, well, wait a second. They look at their paycheck and what once was sizable on the bottom line, when they looked at their top line, it's reducing. And so when looking at the alternatives, looking at self-employment allows you to structure your employment relationship, not only for lifestyle purposes, but for financial gain, where there's incentive for small businesses to work and grow. And so there's usually much lower tax rates, plus you get to write off expenses that if you're working remotely, your cars, your home office, your internet, your TV cable are all written off against your income. So your net at the end of the day as an independent contractor in a lot of jurisdictions is considerably higher. So there's incentive for the workers to work as independent contractors or 1099s, right?
Yeah.
And so the compliance now is so important because employers can't choose not to work with independent contractors. You need to work with independent contractors and freelancers because the top talent are working that way today.
You're saying that most people, or at least the trend for today's society, is that I want to work where I want, when I want, with who I want, and I don't want to be stuck with one company necessarily, or I might want to work with multiple companies at the same time. And then it's not about how much you make, it's about how much you save, which is why we want to be independent contractors. Why are companies so blindly exposed and not actually covered by the independent clauses?
Well, it's an interesting one, right? So independent contracting is not new. It's been around for a long time. Self-employment and working with small vendors is been there too.
Mm-hmm.
What the traditional thought process is with the large enterprises is just to outsource risk, right? By writing a thinly veiled indemnification clause saying, hey, if that person doesn't meet the criteria of the employment laws or the independent contractor regulations in that jurisdiction, that's your problem, right? to the vendor community.
Yep.
But, you know, when you look at all of the case laws, you rarely see the vendor's name in the title of the misclassification article that's saying $500 million misclassification class action lawsuit. It's against Nike, Microsoft, FedEx. There's so many brands that you can talk about that have gotten hit. I'm sorry for picking on those ones, but those just came to mind, just they're common knowledge. And as we move into the gig economy, it's even the platforms that are getting hit, right? So the platforms like Uber, Instacart, all of these that actually, you know, have kind of tried to just disrupt employment models and ignore employment laws, they're getting hit too with this. And so, you know, just writing an indemnification clause to outsource your risk to the vendor community, you're still going to get named in the lawsuit, right?
Yeah,
and if
absolutely.
you take a step back, and I always love to have a conversation with legal within organizations, because they often say, I can always write a contract for that, right? And that's not always the best, more reasonable way to do things. Having proactive monitoring and understanding your risk and how to prevent it often stops a lawsuit from happening. And being proactive like that is very important, because when you look at these lawsuits, the logistics around it, the deep pockets, the big brand is what the employment lawyers are going to go after, what the government agencies are going to go after, because they're receiving the end product, right, of the services. And so they're going to get named. And if you've just blindly said, I don't care what you do, Mr. or Mrs. Vendor, that is your problem, and you haven't actually gone below the surface, the very thin ice of the indemnification clause in that contract, and saw how they are working with their contractors, how they are, what documents they're collecting to build a defense file for you, you're blindly exposed. Because guess what's going to happen? It's going to be a lawsuit that happened based on events that happened 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. And then you're going to have to go to get the documentation that you didn't proactively ask for or understand where it was. You're going to have to go to your, let's say, 1,000 people in your supply chain to get documentation on the 10,000 worker class action lawsuit that happened over the last 5 to 6 years. And you go knock on those vendors' doors. Some will have documentation, others won't. Some will have more mature processes around understanding what ICs are, others won't. And so then all of a sudden, one, it's a massive task to do that in a manual process. And then when you discover you don't have the documentation to defend yourself, guess what the lawyer then turns into? Turns into, let's settle, right?
Yeah.
Just to get rid of this, because we're going to lose the big number. So let's figure out a way to just settle. Anything below that big number is a success, is what lawyers think, the mindset. So then they settle, and then they go, hey, I've got an indemnification clause. So I'm going to go back to my 1,000 vendors from the last 5 years and try to collect the money from those vendors. And you can see me laughing a little bit, because we all know in the industry, the vendors won't hand over a check immediately, right? Or their insurance company is not going to hand over a check. They're then going to have to litigate. And so you've got 5 years to 6 years of litigation up here to defend yourself. You settle, and then you then have to litigate again to try to get to the bottom of the money. That at the end of the day, it may be something your manager did, or it's something you did. So it may not end in your favor to actually get the money out of your 1,000 lawsuits you just had to get your money out. So proactively preventing these claims is the best way to go, right? I'm not saying don't put indemnification clauses in, keep them, but proactively get below them and understand that you have the documentation there, not only to prevent claims from happening, because generally if you're doing better processes, there's more education with the workers and they're doing the right things, and you won't engage someone that doesn't have all the right documentation, the mindset as working as a small business. You won't engage them as an independent contractor. You'll engage them as in the States, a W-2 or a temporary employee elsewhere. And then you're paying the remittances and they're covered with worker comp and all the things that the social safety net that has been built over hundreds of years of employing people, right? And I say that hundreds of years of employing people because we've got all these platforms coming in now, the last few years, right? And they're saying, 100 years of employment law, what did they know, right? And they're just classifying everybody as independent contractors. And that's just a mistake, right? If they're doing the due diligence, sure. If they aren't, they're putting everybody in the whole ecosystem at risk.
Yeah. And so ultimately, if you think about it, governments and these entities are going to go after the person with the biggest wallet. So you own that risk regardless. So is there ways to manage it better? Where at least if you're using smaller vendors, that you're holding them accountable by actually tracking that they have all the documentation there properly, right? So is that what creates a complexity around IC compliance, is the number of vendors and the number of documents you need to track?
Yeah, so there's a number of items that create the complexity. For if you take the step back, every jurisdiction has their regulations. And so there is no magic wand of this is the regulation across the world, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about the complexities, every state in the United States has different regulations, right? There's the federal law and then there's state laws and there's different agency regulations as well. So it's very complex just to study what the regulations are, especially if you're using a global workforce, right?
Yeah.
So that's your first complexity. And then bang, you nailed it. Once you understand those, then you have to get the knowledge to say, well, to mitigate that risk, I need to collect their business registration, their tax IDs. I want to make sure they have insurances. They have a corporate bank account separate from their personal bank account. Some of these things that the worker has invested into their business that proves that they're a separate legal entity and they have the mindset to work independently, right? And so that documentation makes it complex. And then on the worker side, in order to get all that stuff in your business registration, in the past, it used to be very complex. So you'd always go to a lawyer, right? Yeah. And so if I'm working a 3-month gig, right, contract, I'm not going to go to a lawyer and spend $5,000 to get my business set up and insurance policy. That's probably another $2,000 when I only know I'm going to earn 3 months worth of income or revenue, let's call it, because it's self-employment. And so the investment often deterred them from getting set up. And so that complexity was also an issue. What we're seeing today, though, with things like LegalZoom and the Collective and different things out there, different products and services for small business, they can obtain their business registration with 10 to 15 clicks and $199 on a credit card.
True.
Right?
But the other part of it is also that as a large company, I don't have the time to really figure out all the regulatory changes that are happening every week.
Right? Well, that's huge, right? And so that's the foundation. You got to understand what the regulations are. And then after the year of research project that you just did, oops, something else changed, right? And then it throws the apple cart off on what you need to collect and how you need to act. So it's so important to keep on top of that, but that's what makes it complex, is trying to always keep on top, right? So so that's often why legal just blindly says, I'm just going to make that somebody else's problem, right? And hopefully not get caught. The IRS hired 87,000 people last year. 17,000 of them were net new auditors, and they actually published the return on investment of those 17,000 people was almost $1 billion.
Wow.
And so guess what they put on the budget for this year?
Totally.
Another 20,000 auditors, right? And what did they just publish in March? March 11th, they just published new FLSA rules, right? So you've got net new rules. You've got an army of auditors coming out, right? And they're gonna increase their revenue going after companies. And it's not like companies are trying to be offside. It's just it's so hard to keep up, right? And the complexities are there. So it's really important to have all of those things, not only have the knowledge, do the due diligence, and then help your workers. Because if the workers are wanting to be independent contractors and the job allows for it, that it could be done by an independent contractor, because I'm not saying, hey, have a help desk agent that you direct day to day as an independent contractor. I'm not saying that. But if they do want to be independent contractors and the job allows for it and it looks that way and they can behave that way more in a client to vendor relationship, then enable that worker and help them, because there's a lot of great products out there.
Definitely. So why is the market confused then?
So once again, we go back to tradition, right? You know, Ash, we've been in this business a long time, right? And so the marketing that happens changes the terminology to the, you know, how things are done to what's new and exciting, right? And so traditionally, when you had a small pocket of ICs, you'd go to your IC compliance, and when you heard that term, you'd go to your EOR, your employer of record, or your agent of record solution company, right? Because it was always just a small pocket, and often they weren't attached to a staffing vendor or an online platform that actually owned the candidate, right? So the directly sourced or the pre-identified workers who were independent contractors would just be run through a employer of record to do that due diligence that we're talking about around the complexities. And that was great. But now when you look at your entire workforce, right, there's independent contractors everywhere, especially when you look at statement of work and you look at your other staffing suppliers outside of your employer of record. Because typically, if you look at the numbers and the demographics, it'll range. But for the most part, the EOR, or the directly sourced worker talent pool, it represents only like a quarter to a third of the whole contingent program. And that's not even talking about the statement of work, right? And so when you look at it, the confusion is, oh, I got a solution with my IC compliance EOR. They got it all looked after. You're looking after compliance on only a quarter of your workforce, and probably more like a 5% of your workforce when you add statement of work in. So the ticking time bombs that lie under the rest of your supply chain is massive, right? Because once again, different methodologies, levels of maturity. When you hired in or brought in a staffing agency, often you may look at their operational stuff and their ability to help with compliance, but for the most part, you're not. You're asking them about how they can recruit someone for you, right? And so not doing the due diligence on your vendor community and not having a standard method that you know is tried and true goes back to that litigation issue, right? Oh, I'll just sign an indemnification clause, but when you get hit with that lawsuit, you're going to have to go back to your 1,000 suppliers. And then that's where it gets sticky. So proactive approach to risk mitigation is really important. And having the tools to help your vendors and yourself have the data. And like I say, I've said this before, and especially now with all the auditors coming on board, it's a matter of when, not if.
Absolutely. So given that, like, I know that companies aren't going to stop working with smaller vendors because it's part of the D&I initiative as well, right? And it's important to have not have all your eggs in one basket in terms of suppliers. So given that, like, what is independently doing differently to help large organizations manage this more effectively?
Yeah, it's funny how I got back into this industry, right? After selling my last company, I think a lot of people know what it was. And I was in the ER, employer record, and IC compliance industry, right? And coming back into the industry, I went, this problem, it just kept festering in my mind, and brought a new company too that is 100% agnostic, right? So you know, our industry, if they smell that you're going to steal their candidate, or if you're in their lane trying to compete with them, they won't use it. They won't use the tool. They won't, if it's owned by someone that's seen as competitive, it won't
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
So coming in with an agnostic, like a background check tool that does the vetting,
Mhm.
that holds the due diligence and the defense file in the cloud for everybody to use.
Yeah.
And we've paid for the, you know, the legal, the subject matter expertise built into the app, so everybody can use and access that expertise within a
Mhm.
simple to use app that's agnostic, that all suppliers can use across your supply chain. So that even includes your statement of work, where a lot of ICs are hiding right now and no one knows if
True.
it's going to blow up or not, right?
Yeah. Yep. No, absolutely. And how can a company help mitigate the risk of misclassification?
So, you know, there in general better practices around risk mitigation and you know, managing liability.
Mhm.
So, you know, we're all about ease of user experience and making it as quick as possible from finding this person to getting them in a seat in a job.
Yeah.
But if we take a step back and go, okay, we kind of talked about it early on. Let's be proactive and understand what our vendor community is, what
Mhm.
some of the practices they're using. And if, you know, it seems burdensome, give them the tools to help mitigate risk, right? And then think, so like a tool like Independently. We basically work with all staffing agency, online platforms, statement of work providers to be their compliance engine. So it's like a background check. They come through and gives a quick determination, and then that agency can say, yep, makes sense. We can run them as an independent contractor, and there's an insurance-backed indemnification there that they can offer to their clients,
Mhm.
or not. And then if they don't, the worker doesn't meet the criteria, there are ways to enable that self-employment by helping them get a business set up, educating them on being an independent contractor, etc. And they may do these things and buy insurances and that kind of stuff to get there. When I get back to risk management, like a perfect example is insurance, right?
Mhm.
And now with fractional insurance, meaning month to month premiums, not having to buy a large annual policy in
Yeah.
insurance, that is the best way for a large employer to help not only with the worker being classified as an independent contractor, because the worker needs to buy an insurance policy. And then if they have an insurance policy, there's a lot of reasons why that helps them be an independent contractor. It proves that they're investing in their business, their intentions, all sorts of things when you look at the different regulatory factors.
Mhm.
But if you look at it from a risk mitigation standpoint, let's say the person gets hurt on the job, right? And this is one of the number one triggers is either unemployment claim
Mhm.
or a gets hurt on a job. There's an
Yep.
injury. So if an independent contractor gets hurt on the job and doesn't have worker comp, they are going to say, oh my goodness, how am I going to pay for my medical expenses, my income replacement, all of these things? And
Yep.
all of a sudden they conveniently forget they were independent contractors because their lawyer says, let's just say you're misclassified. And then you
Mhm.
get covered under their worker comp, or worse, for the employer side, a personal injury happens and they sue and they're in Texas, and all of a sudden it's a $25 million personal injury claim, right?
Yeah.
So that, you know, pennies on the dollar for white collar workers having worker comp insurance, right, would
Mhm.
mitigate that risk of them even thinking about wanting to claim they weren't an independent contractor, because
Yeah.
the insurance policy would take care of income replacement, um, their healthcare costs, all of that stuff that a worker comp policy does. So
Yeah.
simple things like that would proactively mitigate a misclassification lawsuit because the insurance is there. So simple things like that from a risk mitigation mindset. it's just massive when you take a step back and go,
Yeah.
that makes total sense. So why don't we put that as part of the procurement process?
Yeah.
And it's not getting in the way of talent now. It used to be, but when there's products in the market that it's for white collar worker, it's like $30 to $50 a month. And usually the white collar workers are making 10K a month plus in a lot of cases, right?
Yeah.
So those small expenditures go a long way, not only improving independent contractor status, but manage risk on the downside too. That is the trigger of misclassification.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing to think about is also if you get one audit, they're going to go look back at your last 3 years of all your contractors. And so it's a huge risk because there's probably be more than one that's classified. So this is
Where
really
there's
helpful.
smoke, there's fire is the old saying, and that is true. So if
Yeah.
you proactively are collecting data
Yep.
and you have defense files well organized, then when either a government agent comes in, or I call them ambulance chasing employment lawyers, which they're like personal injury lawyers, that they do it all on pro bono, knowing that there's a big nut to be had and they're going to get a percentage of it. So these people let's just take the lawyers, for instance, that are doing it pro bono, right? So they send in the first letter saying, hey, you misclassified my worker, and they think they're going to get, this big lawsuit that they're going to get a big settlement on. And you come back with a file to say, no, that person wasn't misclassified. We have all the due diligence done. You know what that lawyer does? He goes on to find a more disorganized company and leaves you alone.
100%.
Versus, like you say before, if you catch one, there's probably another 100 there that I'm going to find, right? Or another 1,000 there that I'm going to find. So it's important to be organized proactively. And so I'm glad you brought up that point, Ash, because that's so important, right?
Yeah. Well, this has been great. So if I want to use your product, which I think I definitely do, well, we actually use it, so it's a little bit different, but where can people get in touch with you?
So
To learn more about independent?
it's simple from the standpoint of it's independently.ai. And I'm also on LinkedIn, so you can always DM me and then I'll get you in touch with our team. But it's so important for program leads to think about this now, because especially the domestic US market, with all the new auditors and the new rules that came into place in March, only a month and a half ago, it's reasonable to start to now to audit your workforce to understand where your risk is, because what was compliant before March is not now. And so, or should be tested to see if it's compliant. And so it's so important to think about that from a risk management standpoint. And then once you're compliant, start to monitor it going forward proactively. So yeah, get in touch. Happy to answer any questions on ICs. I've grown up in this market for over 20 years and I love it. And I'm a believer in self-employment, and I've been seeing more and more people take the leap to self-employment. So I'm excited where the future holds for the market.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This is really insightful.
Thanks, Ash.